When we look at that, approximately half, 105,858, comes from those school stop-arm violations. That's $120,256. And that's been a real significant increase this year as compared to prior years. In part, we installed new equipment on our buses this year, and we have it on all of the buses, so the ones we regularly use and our spares. And then the remaining half of that revenue is tuition charged to families. So we charge tuition to people whose children attend Jesse Thackeray Preschool. If they're a peer, they pay tuition to attend. And then we also charge tuition to families who live out of Falls Church City whose students are attending George Mason High School. So that's approximately the other half. And when you look at the details for these categories, you'll see that they're offset by a revenue holding account. And that's for a revenue transaction that's in process. So when the revenue is here, we can go ahead and post it so it gets in the right category. And then after the treasurer's office completes the final posting, that negative holding account will go away. The second item on this chart is use of fund balance. So our budget for this year included $450,000 in one-time funding used to balance the budget. And we have not to date used any or spent any of that funding. The next category that you see is state aid. To date for state aid, we're tracking exactly as we had projected, which is good. This year, the governor's budget proposal in December, which comes out every year, they give you the budget for the next year as well as a revised budget for this year. And one of the good things in this budget is we don't see a big gap between the original budget, which we always base on the governor's proposal, and what the update is now. So that's good. We see a small gap there when we get to the end of the year. But currently, we are on track in terms of that revenue to date. Federal revenue that we receive is primarily for IDEA or special education grants. And to date, we've received our first quarter billing for that IDEA, as well as we've received about 70% of our Title II funding. So that's funding to improve instruction. And those are reimbursable grants. So only after we've experienced the expenditure can we bill to the state to get reimbursed for that grant funding. So if you'll remember, last month we had submitted our first quarterly billing for IDEA, but we hadn't yet received the funds, but they are here now and in this report. And then the last category is our interfund transfers, and transfers from our general government. So the general government transfers are local funding coming from the general government that tends to get posted in the last month of the fiscal year. And then we also have our interfund transfers, and that's transfers coming to the operating fund from the community services fund. It's the indirect expenditures from our extended daycare program. So they help pay for things like utilities, custodial, cleaning, other things like that. That also processes at the end of the school year. When we look at our salary dates, you will see that salaries are tracking very consistently with last year. So for our 12-month employees, we've paid 6 of 12 months worth of wages. And for teachers, we've paid 4 of 12 months. So we pay our teachers over a 12-month period. So the pay that they're going to receive next July and August will get posted to this year's budget. So that's where we're at in terms of to date. So as a percentage of budget, our salaries to date have 62.1% available, which is the exact same percentage that we had available last year at this point in time. And when we look at benefits, we're expending at a slightly faster rate than we did last year with 60% available as compared to 60.6% in the prior year. Just for reference, in terms of benefits, with the exception of the Virginia retirement system, we do pay all of our other benefit costs like health over the full 12-month period. The Virginia retirement system requires that we make our contributions based on people's work schedules. So for teachers, we contribute over 10 months, even though we pay them over 12. Then our last category on this first chart, we've broken them out into the individual categories so you can see contracted services, utilities, insurance, etc. All of those remaining items are really logistics and then our transfers. This category is something that has been less consistent with prior years, which we'll see in just a moment. So when we get to pages 2 and 3, sorry, I'm rolling slowly. On 2 and 3, 2 is a data table and 3 is a bar chart. And what this chart does is it compares the budgets and the actuals for the last 3 years. So again, just to orient people to this chart, revenue is at the top and expenditures are at the bottom. So by those major categories, you're going to see the budget for 2020, 2019, and 2018. Then for period 6, where we're at to date, right, you're going to see how much of the budget for revenue is not yet collected or how much for expenditures was expended to date for 2019 and 18. And then to the far right, you'll see that percentage. So as I just talked about salaries and benefits, for example, on that salaries line, top line of expenditures, you can see that we have 62.1% available, which is exactly the same percentage that we had available last year at this time, and slightly less than what we had available the year before. So far, so good? Okay. So then, page 3 is a bar chart. The bar chart is helpful, I think, in terms of just giving a reference point. You can truly see the consistency in the right with salaries and benefits and that variance in those other categories for logistics. And then you see the revenue to the left. Right. So this is the top of page 4. This is a new chart. It's data that we previously provided, so we started doing projections last year at about mid-year, just about this time. So the chart is similar to what we did last year, but new this year, and also new for the school board members. So what we have on this page is the chart for 1 year, and then on the next page I'll show you our fiscal year end. So again, just to orient people to the chart, you see the revised budget, then you'll see the actuals to date, the encumbrances, and what's available. So that's exactly the same first columns that we had on the first page. To that, we've added where are we projecting that we're going to be for our end of year forecast. We've shown the variance with the budget and what the percent variance is. So I thought I would talk through each of these categories, and then the next page has a chart that compares them with prior years. So overall, when we look at revenue, if you look at the bottom line for revenue, you can see that we're projecting just about $600,000 less in revenue than we budgeted, so $596,756. Right? Immediately, you're like, oh, we're not going to get all the revenue that we budgeted for. That is consistent with our prior years. If we look at the chart on the next page, and I won't jump back and forth, but the chart on the next page shows that in the prior year we had $329,000 less than we had budgeted for in 19. In 18, we actually had $1.2 million less that we budgeted for, and then in FY17 it was $778,000 less than we budgeted for. So I want to talk a little bit about why is that. So I'm going to walk through each revenue category, and I'll get back to the why when we get to the total. So when we look at our other revenue, when we look at that forecast for the end of the year, we're projecting overall that we're going to receive $739,000 in that other revenue, leaving a gap of $102,502. So when you look at that, that's really a combination of things in that category. So the first thing in that category is that revenue from our stop arm cameras is coming in higher than we budgeted. If we look back a couple years ago, we were budgeting for that stop arm cameras, and then there was a pending issue with the courts, so we weren't receiving any, and then it was coming in slower. But this year, we're really doing well in that category. So if we forecast that out continuing for the year, we're slated to come in over in terms of that revenue category. But included in other revenue, we also have something called miscellaneous revenue that includes unbudgeted revenue for grants. So we have a budget for revenue and expenditure, so in the event that we get an unanticipated grant, we can recognize the revenue in that category, and then we already have a line item for expenditure that allows us to give that school or department the funding to access to spend that grant. If we don't get the revenue, we don't have the expenditures, and that revenue and those expenditures cancel each other out. But when you're looking at a forecast presentation this way, at the end of the year, we're showing at this point that we're not going to get that extra grant revenue. So that adds to that revenue shortfall. Continuing along in that line, the next item that you see is that use of fund balance, that negative $450,000. So our budget includes using $450,000 of revenue to balance that budget. Right, at this point, we're not expecting to use that this year, so you see that negative $450,000. When I get to the expenditure section, I'm also going to talk about some contingency expenditure budgets that really offset that revenue budget, again, much like the grants. Right, so in a perfect world, those kind of balance each other out. And I'll talk about how the variance in our expenditures has then in previous years helped us address gaps in state revenue and other revenue categories. So when we look at state revenue on this chart for the end of the year, we're forecasting that we'll just be $44,163 short in state revenue, which is really great. State revenue, we do rely on the governor's budget when we develop our budget each year. What happens in terms of our actuals is they get impacted by multiple things. They get impacted by whatever change the governor makes in the budget, if there's any changes. It also gets impacted by their forecasting what our enrollment is going to be for the next year. If our enrollment comes in lower than that, the state aid that we actually get paid is based on that March ADM, so it could actually be lower, right? So that's one reason in some years our state revenue has come in lower based on our actual average daily membership that they use. When we look at federal grants, we see no variance towards the end of the year. Our federal grant awards are based on our actual known awards. So in general, we shouldn't see any variance in terms of federal grants. But on the next chart, if you'll look, we have had variances in the prior years. That comes from two different categories of things. Sometimes we get additional revenue. So for example, they may give out an additional allocation for Title III. That would give us additional revenue. Or because they're reimbursable grants, sometimes due to the timing of when those grants post, you'll see that we were short revenue. So that's typically the variance in terms of your federal category. And then for our transfer from the general government and our interfund transfers, we're projecting to get exactly what we budgeted, which is typical. It just comes late in the year. So when we look at our expenditures, on our expenditure side, the very bottom line, we are projecting that our expenditures will come in $1,429,481 less than we've budgeted. And when you look, the line directly above that is nearly $800,000, $792,861, and that's from those contingency and reserve accounts. So much like I talked about in the other revenue, we had that unanticipated grants budget of nearly $300,000. We also have additional contingencies and reserves on the expenditure side. So in addition to that additional grant revenue, we have a reserve for contingencies, that's $226,000. That can only be used with the approval of the school board. So some of you will remember that last year we used funding from that contingency account, right? It's typically if we have some major event happen that we were in no way planning for, right? Like the replacement of a floor would be an example there. We also have a reserve for salary adjustments. That's $100,000 in that category. Our teachers are the only people that during the school year have the ability to change their pay. And they can do that by getting additional education credits that allow them to move across salary lanes. So you can go from a bachelor's to a master's or a master's to a master's plus 30. And so we have a $100,000 reserve for salary adjustments. And then the last reserve is new this year. We have a staffing reserve. The current balance there is $166,861. And that was to help us if we had any variances with enrollment projections. So that's that $792,000 number. So now let me go back and I'll talk about the other salary categories on this page. So for salaries, I talked about we were really trending similarly with last year. So we're projecting that at the end of the year, we're going to have a variance of 0.9%, or $310,110, right? That is a decrease from last year of about $55,000. And I'm going to talk to you guys more about the variance in salaries and budgeting when we get to the first budget question. For benefits, we're projecting that we'll have a variance of $354,545. That is higher than last year, and benefits has been a challenge. One of the things that we look at is we have that transitional retirement program, right? That was that retirement benefit that was in place for people from 2002 or 2003. When we budget for that each year, we have to plan on those people who are eligible to participate in that program that they may do so, because that's our liability for the next year. But when you look at this current year's budget, for example, of the people that were eligible to do so, many of them did not retire and they're still working, right? So that does contribute to the variance in terms of our budget for benefits. The TRP, there's now very few people left. So in terms of the remaining people that can still retire, it's less than 10, right? And what's happening now is that benefit pays people for 5 years. So as we've been paying people, right now we're experiencing more people dropping out of that benefit than we are stepping in, and that's why you'll see in the budget for next year we have a decrease. That decrease is based on the people whose payments we know will end this June 30th. But we have to assume that the people that are eligible to retire may retire. They don't have to tell us until as late as June, right? Or for 12-month people, they could really retire at any time. Yeah, you're welcome. So then on the remaining categories on this page, we're projecting that we'll have some slight underspending in terms of our contracted services, $64,000. But we are projecting that we're going to overspend in terms of our utilities. So when you look at our utilities budget, we have been overspending. When we opened Mount Daniel Elementary School with the additional square footage, we did not